Welcome. I'm Neal Gorenflo, co-founder of Shareable. I've been invited by my friends at Common Trust to host a series of conversations about their new book, Assets in Common, Stories of Business and Community Leaders, Remaking the Economy from the Ground Up. It proposes an ambitious yet pragmatic pathway for scaling the shared and steward ownership economy and backs this up with some deeply researched case studies and analysis. Today is episode 3, and we have Chelsea Robinson, Charity May, and Jay Standish. Welcome back, team. Okay, so you introduced yourselves in episode 2, but just quickly share your name, title, and affiliation for review, and the full bios are in the show notes.
Great. Thank you, Neal. Happy to be here. Happy to be with everyone. My name is Charity May. I am the principal and founder of Sacred Futures, which is a regenerative systems design practice, reimagining how we can build a new economy together. And I have the privilege of being a senior researcher and co-author for the book Asset in Commons, working with Common Trust and these colleagues here.
Yeah, thanks, Charity. Jay.
My name is Jay Standish. My background's as an entrepreneur and also a senior researcher and co-author of this book.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chelsea Robinson. I'm representing both the Purpose Foundation in the U.S. and also Common Trust as a project manager and lead of this project. And my role has really been as an editor. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So, Jay, let's start off with you. One of the key structural patterns in the book, and that's one of the things we're going to focus on with this episode, is some of the patterns across different companies and arrangements. So one of these is holding companies or roll-ups. GoodWorks Evergreen in Montana is a great example. Give us some background on them, including how they're structured, and then tell us about the benefits of their approach.
Sure. So GoodWorks Evergreen started as a investment project led by a family office, which is essentially when some people have a lot of wealth, they can hire a third-party manager to help them make investments and manage that wealth. And so that's what a family office is. It was a woman who inherited significant wealth and is a local Montanan and really wanted to put those dollars to work in Montana toward positive outcomes. And so they also have a nonprofit arm that gives grants. GoodWorks Evergreen is a for-profit investing arm, but is focused on creating rural economic development. And so what GoodWorks does is over the course of the last 7 or 8 years, they've bought 8 companies, 7 of which are all essentially hardware stores in rural small towns in Montana. And they've brought those 7 hardware stores all under one roof, and they have a common manager across all the stores. They use the same system. So they really essentially merged these hardware stores together so that they run in a more efficient way and have enabled those stores to stay in business where they would otherwise probably go out of business because they're really small local hardware stores that wouldn't have had a buyer. And so GoodWorks kept them alive and merged them together and created a positive outcome for these communities where losing 5 jobs in a town of 200 is a big percentage of the unemployment that would happen.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, if you've ever been to Montana, lots of land and not many people, so I can see how that can work. I remember here in Mountain View, not exactly analogous, but we lost our local hardware store. It was just downtown and it was great to go and pick up stuff. And it just, it sucks when you lose in a town, a community business. It's just, there's kind of invisible connections that you might take for granted, but just woven in the community if it's been a longstanding business. Charity, another key structural theme in the book is multi-stakeholder cooperatives, which bring together different classes of members like workers, consumers, and investors even. So using Mondragon Corporation as an example, can you tell us what governance mechanisms they use to balance the priorities of these diverse stakeholders, which all have different interests, right?
That's exactly right. Thank you, Neil. Yeah, multi-stakeholder cooperatives emerge from what we typically would understand as being worker cooperatives. So really centered on one core stakeholder. And the beauty of multi-stakeholder cooperatives is structurally identifying ways in which individual cooperative firms that have distinct stakeholders, those individual cooperatives actually being a member of a larger cooperative. And so that's the definition of a multi-stakeholder cooperative, where you have these different types of stakeholders that are coming together. And the kind of the design component to weigh the interests of these various stakeholders appropriately for the intended purpose. Doesn't necessarily have to be one member, one vote. There could be nuances and gradients in terms of who gets to weigh in on strategic decisions versus who has an economic stake or interest in the cooperative as well. And just to touch on specifically the governance mechanisms that are used, I first want to just lay out that there are different forms, different ways that people come together to govern, and governance in and of itself is decision making. And the ability to have the right people at the table at the right time. So what you'll see in Mondragon Corporation and also within the individual firms is that there's a distinction between strategic direction and decision making and day-to-day management operations.
Right. Yeah.
And so those day-to-day management operations are held, I would say, at the local level, at the level of the firm, with people who are deeply vested and interested in and understand the nuances related to the enterprise. Whereas the strategic decision-making factors can be held at a higher level. And so Mondragon has formed a Congress, as it were, of representatives from each of these individual firms
Yeah.
and each of the individual cooperative firms to participate in the broader governance of what Mondragon is about, what direction that they're taking, but the day-to-day operations and specific decisions related to the individual firm stays at the firm level.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. So you spoke a little bit to this, but I wonder if you could elaborate some. How does this multi-stakeholder approach create value? What are the benefits?
Yeah, I think a couple of ways that the multi-stakeholder cooperative creates value is it lends itself to more diversification. It also embraces complexity. Multi-stakeholders say, you know what, we're going to embrace the complexity of all of these different interests and figure out ways to come to the table and hold that appropriately. And that's where the governance structure comes into place. It also allows for the fluidity of sharing resources in a way that honors autonomy and honors the individuality of the participants that are participating in that ecosystem. One quick example of that for Mondragon is that some of the cooperative members are tied to innovation and research. So some of the industrial enterprises reap the benefit of being in relationship with, being proximate to the groups that are conducting research and development. They get first look, first take in integrating, maybe it's a developed product or developing a new process, but also innovation. So all of that knowledge sharing is happening within that network and ecosystem. But again, it's still open and it honors the autonomy of the individual participants of that.
Yeah. And speaking to that, one of the companies within Mondragon Corporation as an umbrella, as a kind of holding company, they left the corporation. The structure doesn't lock in companies. But what happened there?
Yeah, that was a really interesting find and development has happened over the last handful of years with Mondragon Corporation. There were two cooperatives in distinct regions in Spain that self-elected to withdraw from being identified as a cooperative tied to the Mondragon Corporation. And so prior to that decision, Mondragon was, I believe the numbers are definitely over 80,000 workers were being represented. But when those two cooperatives that were quite large themselves stepped away, that removed about 11,000 workers from the network as a whole. And it's about 15% revenues in totality for Mondragon Corporation.
Yeah, not a small doing.
Not a small doing, but also it was reflecting it is inherent to the cooperatives and how they form of open and voluntary membership.
Yeah.
So they had every right at the individual cooperative level, their general assembly, similar to the process of being adopted into the Mondragon Corporation, they have to review and agree. That's what they want to do. So that general assembly reviewed and agreed at this time, we think it would be better for our members and for our operations to withdraw and to have a different sort of relationship with Mondragon. I think time will tell how that relationship evolves over time.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, that's a little bit more, and we go into a little bit more detail in the book as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay. This is one for the group, more of a round table question. Another major aspect of these infrastructural concepts is governance and economic interests. There were multiple cases with democratic governance models where voting rights weren't necessarily tied to ownership stakes. So I'm curious, can you discuss some of the pros and cons of separating economic interests from governing control? What safeguards are important when implementing these models?
I'll just kick off by saying that this whole episode and conversation today around structure, governance, ownership, traditionally, I think that when people talk about who owns a company or who owns that piece of land, a lot of that word ownership is traditionally thought of as economic interest. Who's going to benefit from the upside when that sells? And we'll talk about terminal value probably either in this episode or the next one. And when you dig deeper into what ownership is, and a lot of people who have researched this themselves will know, you find this legal concept of the bundle of rights. The bundle of rights is really saying that ownership itself is a concept made up of a number of different rights. Your right to alienate other people from using something, your right to use it in perpetuity, et cetera, your right to access something. So we may have a different bundle of rights for different assets that we have a relationship with, and however we structure those. To your point, Charity, that you made earlier, a lot of ownership can be very creatively designed. So you can have very different kinds of rights depending on how you design it. So I think this question is wonderful because it really teases out that governance rights and economic rights can be different. And so when we're looking at structuring some of these larger institutions that are connecting many entities or many assets together to help us with this kind of broader goal of developing an alternative to the default economic growth pathway, we can actually start with those very fine-tuned points of what does ownership mean in this context? Who gets what kinds of benefits? Who gets what kinds of rights? One of the case studies that I wrote was about Inspiral, for example. The Inspiral network does have a differentiation between governance and economic interest because it's a nonprofit-owned corporation, and we can talk about that at another point. But basically, if you are a shareholder of Inspiral, if you are a member of Inspiral, you have a right to vote. It doesn't necessarily give you any guaranteed right to shared upside from a financial perspective. And quite a lot of our case studies showed that there was this sort of carefully designed differentiation between economic interest and governance. Now, one of the motivations for why that differentiation is so important, and this comes up a lot in the steward ownership literature, if people want to dig deeper on that, is that in essence, steward ownership is very interested in the separation of governance and economic interest. Because when we fuse them together, like what we've done in a lot of how our economy is running right now, we can get some perverse incentives where people are actually incentivized to try and get more financial or economic upside through the decisions that they make about a company. So in some cases, you might have a private equity firm that owns a dentist's office, right? That's becoming more and more common. And those dentist offices are placed under management incentives where they have to reduce costs, reduce time spent per patient, reduce cost of acquiring a patient, et cetera, all towards that motivation of economic gain from the people who are governing that bigger organization, whose ultimately their interest is the economic upside, not necessarily the purpose of the business, which is providing high quality dental care. So whenever we have the opportunity to separate governance interests and economic interests, we can enhance the integrity of service provision, and we can enhance the integrity of what businesses do for their local people and places. That hardware store in Mountain View, Neal, that you talked about, if
Yeah.
one of their stated purposes and if part of their governance structure was to serve the people of Mountain View, and that was enshrined in some of their legal and ownership format, then they would be reliably performing against that goal because that's what they're required to do. But if the economic interests and governance interests are fully aligned in every case, you find time and time again that people end up making compromise decisions because they are incentivized to make a decision based on personal economic gain oftentimes. So that's just zooming out, but I'd be really interested, Jay and Charity, what would you add to that, and what examples would you draw upon as well?
Yeah, I can add an example that maybe, Chelsea, you can correct me if I have these numbers wrong, but Bosch, the German industrial company that makes a lot of construction tools, saws, as well as they make auto parts, like your windshield wiper blades might be made by Bosch. They are a Stewart-owned company and quite an old company. And my understanding is the family that was the majority shareholder essentially granted the shares of the company into a foundation that is a charitable foundation. And so that foundation, I believe, owns around 97% of Bosch, the vast majority of shares. And that foundation, their role is to give away the money and to be really expert at making grants to make positive impact in the world. And that's what they focus on. They're not operators and managers of an industrial manufacturing company. That's not their expertise. And so it's this inverted thing where they own 97%, but they only have 3% governance. And then essentially the managers of the company and the board of the company is an operating board, and they have 97% control of the governance of the company that's producing the profit, but they don't actually have a financial incentive in the way that boards normally do. And so that's an interesting example of this sort of flip in relationship between financial interest and governance.
But I think that I would add to what Chelsea and Jay have just shared is just highlighting that when founders and business leaders start thinking about getting a little bit more creative about separating that interest, it allows you to get a vision for the long term. Okay, with every single one of those. Jay, you were just talking about Bosch, long-standing business, and by tying the purpose that's being stewarded by the nonprofit with the nonprofit's purpose being identified to not go anywhere, versus what we typically find in public companies. Again, their allegiance is to the shareholder and meeting a return. And so these quarterly investor calls that are happening, are you at target? Are you behind target? Are you above target? It enables and allows those who are making operational decisions for the business to take a breather and to really build towards a long-term, long-standing future. And I just want to put a pin on that. That is so needed and imperative for changing our relationship with the environment, with each other, landscapes that we are operating in and out of. And this is not something that we talk about in the book, but it is tied to governance and thinking about creative ways. There are some really amazing movements that are looking at how can the voice of nature be brought to the table in governance, whether that's in a stewardship format and linking that to business outcomes and business initiatives as well. And so I think the examples that we've outlined in the book, but also the conversations that we're having with other builders, is just the beginning of what might be possible.
Yeah, interesting. So Sherry, while we're talking to you, let's talk about Namaste Solar. They integrated into a cooperative ecosystem spanning operations, financing, and purchasing power. What were the key benefits and challenges of federating that network of interconnected co-ops?
Yeah, Namaste Solar was an interesting model because they're based in Colorado, but they first began as a C Corp, with the founders just starting a C Corp solar installation company. And the founders, they had these inherent cooperative values. Even with the C Corp, when they were hiring folks, they wanted to make sure that there was representation in in day-to-day operations and governance decisions. So they did have a one member, one vote model and concept that it was tied to economic interest at some point. But as they grew and continued to establish their culture as an enterprise, and as they were also looking externally into the ecosystem of solar installation, you know, that particular industry, you need to be able to source the materials at an appropriate price. Once you do install, you need to be able to maintenance the equipment appropriately and provide that service. All of those components require capital of some kind. So you need to have creative, flexible capital. And so their process was actually quite evolutionary and very organic. As they grew, they met one of those challenges and stopped and asked the question, how do we address this challenge? And so specifically, Namaste Solar was thinking about expanding to another state, and they tried it and it didn't work very well. And they found out that, we actually are better to be hyper local, but we have expertise and resources. How can we expand and grow maybe beyond? And so that's where the idea of the purchasing co-op was it developed and formed, because they weren't the only one that needed to aggregate their resources together to be able to purchase the equipment for their service. And so they began to network with other solar installers to come together and form the purchasing equipment. And then that lent itself to all of these solar installation companies. We also need support in operations and maintenance. And so the next cooperative that formed out of this ecosystem that was developing was that, and they since expanded into bringing capital through a credit union and eventually an investment arm. But forming in a multi-stakeholder cooperative was important to allow, again, for the autonomy and the flexibility of different interests coming together to participate in the solar ecosystem more broadly.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds just a kind of evolutionary process. And when a challenge arose, then come up with a unique organizational kind of innovation to meet it. Speaking of that, Jay, holding companies, this is a big part of the book. You wrote that holding companies are at their best when they utilize purpose or steward ownership, where ownership model balances pursuing their purpose with business needs. Why is structuring holdcos as steward owned? Why is that important?
So sort of the best of both worlds in terms of scale, as well as impact and autonomy, as well as benefit to workers, customers, and stakeholders. On the other end of the story, we see large companies or private equity firms that own portfolios of companies that are detached from the reality on the ground where their businesses are operating. And like Chelsea was mentioning, the dentist office, trying to optimize it to the point where the quality of the care goes out the window because it's just about the financials at the end of the day. And so holdcos are a great way of grouping together small businesses so that they benefit from some of the things that scale affords in terms of saying, hey, we need this expensive $100,000 a year software to do a better job running our inventory system. And as a small hardware store, you're not going to afford that. That's the total profit that store makes a year. But if you're joined up with 700 hardware stores around the country, you can afford that software. And so small business gets to benefit from some of the cost savings as well as access to resources that larger companies would be able to, but maintain some autonomy, maintain a focus on workers and quality and customers and delivering real value to the people that are involved in the business day to day, rather than just trying to extract value for the financial owners of the company.
And that's the part of the steward ownership. There's certain obligations written into that. And it could be a range of obligations, right? It could be towards employees. It could be towards the environment towards the community. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, we hear a lot about fiduciary responsibility, which I always thought it meant financial. I thought fiduciary meant financial, but it actually means like responsibility to something. And so in a steward-owned company, there is a fiduciary responsibility to fulfill on the purpose, the stated purpose of the organization. And
Right.
that could be to benefit employees. So a steward-owned company that's really an employee-owned company, their purpose would be to distribute any profits to employees, but also perhaps do trainings and leadership development and give better benefits and improve the lives of their workers, if that's their focus of like how they think they can make an impact in people's lives. Or you might have a company that donates a bunch of its profits and is really focused on, say, climate justice in urban neighborhoods and helping people with the health impacts of pollution in certain cities that they might operate in, if that's something they really care about. Another key kind of design piece of how you structure a steward-owned company, they have a clause that say, we will never sell the company unless it's like
Right.
insolvent and it's going out of business. But if the company is running, we will not sell it. And
Right.
that really protects the company from getting absorbed into a company that won't honor the intended impact and purpose of the stewardship model.
Right. It just takes them off the table.
Yeah.
Off the menu, right? Yeah, I love that combo of the steward ownership with holdcos. Chelsea, you wrote about the Inspiral Network, which I believe you have direct experience with. I'd love to hear a little bit about that. And they started as one company with many business units under one roof and then shifted to a network services model. Explain that.
Yeah, so in this whole episode, we're talking about structure, we're talking about like legal formats, and I think Inspiral is a really interesting case. So this is something based out of New Zealand, but it's now all over the world as well. There's Inspiral Europe and Inspiral Web3 and all these different things. One of the things that I wanted to bring up as I speak about Inspiral is just recognize that not all of these formats are about local benefit. Like they don't have to be. Like I think that there's like an interesting assumption that we tend to make, especially in this alternative ownership movement and also like co-op friendly movement, that everything always has to be about employee benefit and local benefit. But some of the ways that we can structure these things, especially when we're talking about like purpose ownership and steward ownership, we can design it for really macro intentions. We could have a purpose statement of a company that is basically about investing in post-capitalism or something like that. And that's not necessarily strictly for local benefit, but that could be part of what the company is designed to invest in. So I just wanted to also point that out. So in that spirit, Inspiral was really set up to help more people work on stuff that matters, is the purpose statement or the mission statement. So more people work on stuff that matters because so many of us, so many talented people in this world are working for extractive industry. So Inspiral tried to create a competitive alternative for people to be able to band together with their talent and create work that felt truly rooted in their values and their purpose. Structurally, at the beginning of Inspiral, it was just one legal entity that was owned by one individual. His name is Joshua Weil, and he was like a benevolent controller and fiduciary, to use your word, Jay, of this single entity. As the network grew, more people got on board with, I want to help create like a creative agency, or I want to add my skills as a software developer. And so it became like a little freelancer network, but again, still under that one roof structurally. And so going back to Charity's narrative about Namaste Solar and how it had this kind of legal evolutionary discovery process, Inspiral also had an evolutionary process to figure out what legal structure would serve its purpose best at that time. And so at the beginning, it was one entity controlled by one person who was just like benevolently running it as a fiduciary on behalf of the group. And then more and more legal entities started cropping up so that it then became what you referred to, Neal, as a network services model, where it was, and it still is today, it has one nonprofit entity, the Inspiral Foundation, as the umbrella entity that everybody else becomes a member of. So whether you're an accounting company that is a member or you're an individual who's a member, you're a member of that umbrella institution that provides services to everybody who's agreed to be part of it. So just like what Jay was saying about holding companies giving the benefits of scale to small businesses, this kind of umbrella network services model allows for people who are members of Inspiral to access shared network infrastructure. Could be coaching and mentoring, could be funded therapy, could be access to their collaborative funding environment, could be office space, could be whatever it is. But the thing I'm trying to point out here is that when we're talking about structure, which we're doing in today's episode, really just highlighting that it's oftentimes an evolutionary journey. And in Namaste Solar's case, it was about going, oh, should we expand regionally? No, we should expand vertically. And then figuring out the solution to that. And then in Spiral's case, it was, oh, are we one entity or are we many entities, or can we be both? Can we be like a sort of, are we a holding company model or are we a network services model? And different things are useful at different times, but how do you still preserve the values and the governance format to enable a values-aligned approach to the way that you operate that network? So I just think there's so much more detail we could go into there, but I guess I just really want to emphasize, values-driven governance, evolutionary legal structures. And if you are looking at this content or reading this book and you're thinking about how to adopt some of this, treat your own situation as a unique one where you have to design for what you all need and what your stakeholders need and what your purpose is and what your mission is. And that might change over time, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, that really makes sense, Chelsea. Yeah, and the book is like this palette of different colors that you can paint a painting with, right? Giving inspiration. One last question for the group, and we'll wrap. So, reading the book, this is a deeply researched book, footnotes galore. I'm curious, what challenges did you face in the research process? Was it difficult to get that detailed information on the structure of these companies? Some of them are private and they don't make their information public. So I'm just curious about that.
I'll just start off by saying that we had the privilege of having very high communication and very high access with a lot of our amazing interviewees and our amazing case study representatives. We really went out of our way at every chance we could get to have a really intimate shared understanding of what is the story of your organization from the perspective of the person running it. We really wanted this book to be for builders, like what Charity said earlier, for people who are really at the helm of some of these organizations, and for people whose day-to-day responsibility is a fiduciary one or is a responsibility where they're managing assets under their own control. And so in order to create a lot of empathy and relatability, we really wanted to be in direct communication with people who were struggling with that challenge and who had for themselves firsthand identified solutions that worked for them in their context and be able to share that also in their own words. So almost all of the case studies are really supported by the people who created the solutions that we wrote about and also had their sign off and their support to express it in the way that we expressed it in the book, and including with their quotes and diagrams and anything else that they wanted to share. So I would say in that sense, we just really wanted to bring our highest integrity to that process.
Yeah, it sounds like the book really benefited from a lot of primary research, like talking to people actually in the field, which, wow, that's very valuable. The best kind of research that you can do. Jay, you were chiming in.
Yeah, I'd say one of the biggest challenges is just each of these projects or companies or is multiple people's life's work. And so the big challenge is really just how to pare it down and where to focus, because multiple books could be written on each of these initiatives.
Yeah.
And, we've all been involved in organizations, and there's so much more to the story, so much nuance, and so much in the personalities of the people involved. And the challenges is on finding the tidbits that are most relevant to the research that we're doing and to draw that out and really bring forth, the elements that are interesting and unique, while also giving a picture of the whole and where it comes from, what the context is.
Yeah, and focusing on what could be helpful to others too. I think you guys focused on that. And Charity, anything you want to add?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is reflecting on a challenge that was a welcome challenge. It wasn't something that hindered the work, but the fact that this book only has a select number of case studies. And one of the main questions that we wanted to assist the builders in exploring is what options are out there. And many of us need to see tangible examples and models. So figuring out a way to be as wide as we possibly could. So we have examples from, grassroots level between individual people all the way up to these international interconnected corporations in different countries. So the span was quite broad. And then finding examples to be able to tell the story of those who are doing the work. It was very much a welcome challenge, but also highlighting that this is a teaser,
Yeah.
right? It's a teaser and our hope, at least my hope is definitely that this sparks a lot of interest or the formation of new ideas, integrating old ideas with new ones so that maybe there's another wave of case studies that we can share from different angles and different lenses in the future.
Right. Version 2. Yep. On that note, we'll wrap up. This concludes episode 3 of our Assets in Common conversation series. Thank you, Chelsea, Charity, and Jerry. In our next episode, we'll go deeper on the structural aspects of these companies with the same crew as today. I'll see you then. Thanks for joining us.